In 1867, a mansion burned to the ground, but what was found buried beneath it was never meant to see the light of day. In the dead of winter, the Thornfield estate in Cumberland County, Maine, was engulfed in flames. The townspeople gathered to watch the inferno rage, thinking it was just another tragic accident, but they had no idea what that fire was hiding. When firefighters descended into the charred remains of the basement, they froze. Lining the walls were rows upon rows of glass jars, each one meticulously labeled with names, dates, and symbols that looked almost occult. And inside floated fragments of what appeared to be human brain tissue, suspended in an amber solution that gave off a sickly sweet, rotting scent. But that wasn't even the worst part. Laid out across wooden tables were hundreds of leather-bound journals, every page filled with hand-drawn portraits of human faces, contorted in unspeakable agony, alongside clinical notes in a beautiful feminine hand. The term that kept appearing over and over? Experimental psychological reconditioning. These weren't medical records. They were case studies, detailed accounts of people's minds being shattered methodically, one layer at a time. Sheriff Thomas Hartwell would later confess that he discovered a locked room in the back of the house, and inside, the walls were covered from floor to ceiling with black and white photographs, before and after shots of the same people, healthy and smiling in one, hollow-eyed and broken in the next. Each photo was numbered. Each number matched a preserved brain. Each matched a journal entry. For over 2 decades, the Thornfield sisters had convinced wealthy families across New England that they ran a state-of-the-art healing facility for the mentally unwell. But in truth, they were running something far more sinister. What those families had paid for was not treatment. It was transformation, forced, unnatural, and horrifying. And behind the curtain of elegance and progress lay a twisted obsession with control, obedience, and the human mind reduced to an experiment. The government tried to bury it. The official report claimed the facility had merely violated accepted medical standards. But the truth was darker than anyone dared to admit. This wasn't therapy. This was human experimentation. So disturbing, even the darkest asylums in Europe wouldn't touch it. The Thornfield sisters weren't just ahead of their time. They were beyond anything the world had ever seen, and not in a good way. They were conducting psychological experiments so extreme, so inhuman, that if you heard the full truth, you might not sleep tonight. But before we go further into the horrors buried inside the Thornfield estate, you need to know something. This channel, it's not for everyone. It's only for the few who dare to uncover America's darkest, most forbidden history. These are stories the world tried to erase. And we ask just one question. Will you be one of the brave few who chooses to know? Because what happened next will leave you breathless. The fire that destroyed the Thornfield estate in 1867? It wasn't a random tragedy. It was a desperate act of vengeance, a final, burning scream from someone who had seen too much. Her name was Sarah Peton, the only surviving patient. Somehow, she had clung to just enough sanity to understand what was happening to her. She set the fire herself, not to escape, but to end the horror once and for all. But to understand what led Sarah to that point, we have to go back to Cumberland County, Maine, in the 1840s, a place where old Puritan beliefs were colliding with radical new ideas about medicine, morality, and the mind. It was a land of booming wealth, timber, shipping, and power, and with that came a dark dilemma. Among the elite, what do you do with a family member who breaks? Back then, mental illness wasn't diagnosed. It was judged. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, these weren't conditions. They were curses, moral failings, shameful weaknesses that could ruin an entire bloodline's reputation. So what did wealthy families do? They hid them. They paid quietly to send their troubled relatives away, out of sight, out of memory, to places that promise healing. Places like Thornfield, and that's when they arrived. 4 sisters, each one brilliant, each one broken in her own terrifying way. Constance, the eldest, was 32, Striking, cold, intelligent. She had studied briefly at the Troy Female Seminary in New York, but it wasn't academic knowledge she craved. It was control. She believed the human mind wasn't sacred. It was malleable, bendable, breakable, shapeable. Her younger sister, Margaret, had a gift that was almost unnatural. She could read people, feel their fears, their traumas, and use them like tools. Then came the twins. Eleanor, an apothecary with a hidden garden of herbs, roots, and toxins. She knew exactly what plants could shatter a person's grip on reality or erase it entirely. And Beatrice, the youngest, cold, curious. She had studied in European hospitals, and she claimed she had worked under doctors who believed the body could be changed through pain, through force. Together, the Thornfield sisters weren't offering treatment. They were offering transformation. Whether the patient survived it or not didn't seem to matter. They called it progress. But what they built was a foundation of madness. The Thornfield sisters weren't just pretending to be healers. They believed they were revolutionaries, and they sold it perfectly. Their language was elegant, persuasive, and scientific. They talked about systematic observation, control intervention, and the reshaping of consciousness. It all sounded so advanced, so rational. To desperate families, it was a miracle. Behind their calm, intelligent eyes was a vision that would terrify even the boldest minds in medicine. They purchased the old Hartwell mansion, a massive, decaying 3-story estate that had been abandoned for nearly 10 years, ever since its last owner died in circumstances so suspicious. The locals refused to speak about it. It stood alone, surrounded by 200 acres of dense, whispering pine forest. No nearby neighbors, no passing travelers, just silence. And that's exactly what the sisters wanted. They didn't want visitors. They wanted control. For months, the Thornfield sisters oversaw a complete transformation of the property. And at the center of it all was Constance, orchestrating everything with terrifying precision. She ordered construction of new basement rooms, thick walls, heavy steel doors, each with a small observation window, like prison cells. They installed speaking tubes that allowed the sisters to communicate with patients without ever setting foot in their rooms. Everything was soundproofed. Constance claimed it was for therapeutic privacy, but the workers said the silence down there felt wrong, like it was built to hide something. Even stranger, she insisted on a custom ventilation system, one that could pipe specific vapors into individual rooms. She called them medicinal, but no one knew what they were. By the spring of 1845, their vision was complete. The Thornfield Therapeutic Institute was open, but they didn't post signs. They didn't publish advertisements. They worked in the shadows. Discreet letters to powerful physicians, private conversations at elite social clubs, whispers in the halls of medical conferences. Their pitch was simple: confidential care, revolutionary results, complete discretion. The response? Overwhelming. Families across New England, terrified of scandal, desperate for solutions, began inquiring. But the Thornfields didn't accept just anyone. They handpicked their patients. Only the most inconvenient cases. Only those whose families could pay massive fees, and who could disappear without too many questions. And then came patient one, James Wentworth, 24 years old, son of a wealthy Boston merchant, bright, handsome, and suffering from what doctors call melancholia and spiritual confusion. His parents were told this place could save him, but what they actually sent him into was the beginning of something far darker. James Wentworth was a perfect patient, at least in the eyes of the Thornfield sisters. The 24-year-old son of a powerful Boston merchant, James had just returned from Harvard College when everything started to unravel. His family described sudden bursts of intense sadness, erratic, inappropriate behavior, and a darkness they didn't understand. Today, we might call it PTSD, the aftermath of some traumatic event he likely endured during his studies. But back then, it was seen as shameful, embarrassing, a threat to the family's reputation. On a gray April morning in 1845, James arrived at the Thornfield Institute. He was accompanied by his father, stone-faced, silent, and a trusted family physician. They believed they were bringing James to a place of healing. Waiting at the door were the sisters. Polished, professional, calm. Constance stood tall, speaking with cool confidence about their pioneering treatment techniques. Margaret, in just a glance, pinpointed James's deepest fears, a gift that chilled a physician to the bone. But he said nothing. The family was given a tour of the public areas of the mansion, plush sitting rooms, an elegant library, and a medical room that looked exactly as it should. Everything seemed normal, comforting, safe. The sisters explained that treatment required complete isolation, no letters, no visits. It was for the patient's own good, they said. No outside interference. James's father hesitated, but paid the fee, nearly $30,000 in today's money, and left his son behind, convinced he had done the right thing. It was the last time he would ever see James alive, and he wouldn't find out the truth for over 2 decades. What really happened to James? It began the moment the front door shut behind his family. The Thornfield sisters wasted no time. They initiated something they called systematic psychological deconstruction, a method not to heal, but to erase the patient's mind, piece by piece. The idea was horrifying: destroy the existing personality and rebuild a new one from the ground up. At first, James was placed in a warm, peaceful bedroom on the 2nd floor. It looked normal. It felt safe, but it was all part of the trap. Over the next few days, everything around him started to change, but in ways so subtle, so calculated, it didn't seem deliberate. Not at first. Chairs were moved while he slept. Meals came at random hours, sometimes 2 a day, sometimes none at all. The temperature in his room swung from freezing to stifling without warning. It was all intentional. The sisters had discovered a terrifying truth. Human beings rely on consistency to stay sane. Remove it, and the mind begins to slip. James's descent had begun. James Wentworth was unraveling, and the Thornfield sisters were thrilled. They had discovered something chilling. If you want to dismantle a human mind, you don't need violence. You just need to make them doubt their reality. By introducing small, unpredictable changes to his surroundings, shifting furniture, altering meal times, playing with the temperature, they erased his sense of stability. James started second-guessing everything. Is this really happening? Or am I losing my mind again? That was exactly what they wanted. Then Eleanor stepped in, the apothecary of the group, the silent poisoner. Without James knowing, she began dosing his food with precise amounts of plant-based compounds, natural substances that wouldn't cause sickness, but would amplify anxiety, paranoia, and confusion, just enough to push his mind deeper into the fog. And James? He wrote it all down. The sisters encouraged him to keep a journal. They called it therapeutic, but in reality it was their field notes. And in those pages, James described waking dreams, phantom voices, shifting shadows that dance in the corners of his vision. They were creating his madness and cataloging it like scientists in a lab. Behind the mansion's walls was a hidden network of observation panels and speaking tubes. The sisters watched everything, recording each moment James flinched, questioned, or broke down. To them, he wasn't a person. He was data. He was the perfect experiment. 2 weeks later, the next phase began. James was told he'd be moved to the basement for intensive treatment. What he didn't know was that the basement wasn't a hospital ward. It was a lab of control. His new room was sterile and cold, white walls, a narrow bed, and a collection of scientific equipment. It looked medical. It felt clinical. But nothing here was meant to heal. This was one of the sisters' most disturbing creations: the controlled sensory environment, a space where every element of the patient's experience could be manipulated with absolute precision. James's room could go from blinding white light to pitch-black darkness with a flick of a switch. Temperature could swing from suffocating heat to bone-deep cold. Sound could be deafening or completely, hauntingly silent. But the worst part? They were always there. Through the speaking tubes, the sisters could enter his mind at any moment. Day or night, a voice might appear, soft, cold, relentless. They called it a psychological dialogue. But it wasn't a conversation. It was mental warfare. Constance would speak to him for hours, calm, calculated, asking about his memories, then planting seeds of doubt. Are you sure that happened? Did your father ever really love you? Harvard? You were never there, James. She wasn't treating his trauma. She was reprogramming him. And slowly it was working. They weren't just manipulating James. They were remaking him. Day by day, hour by hour, the Thornfield sisters chipped away at his mind. Margaret, with her eerie, almost psychic intuition, would lead long conversations with James, subtly, feeding his fears, turning mild anxieties into full-blown obsessions. What once made him uncomfortable now consumed his every waking thought. Eleanor, precise, cold, clinical, observed his body like a scientist with a specimen. She would point out the smallest tremor in his hand, the twitch in his eye, the way he blinked, until James became terrified of his own movements. He couldn't hide, not even from himself. And all the while, they were documenting everything. They tracked his sleep. They recorded his emotional swings. They monitored how long he resisted, and the moment he stopped, because they weren't looking for healing. They were hunting for breaking points, moments when a person's entire identity shattered, when the defenses gave out and the human inside collapsed. For James Wentworth, that moment came after 6 weeks of relentless psychological assault. The sisters had discovered his deepest secret, a death at Harvard, a classmate, an accident, or something worse. James blamed himself, but the sisters made sure he believed. It was all his fault. They whispered it. They repeated it. They circled around it until guilt became grief, and grief became madness. And then, just like that, James broke. The young man who had once been articulate, educated, troubled but whole, was gone. What remained was a hollow version of him, open, suggestible, empty. In their notes, the sisters described this new state with a phrase they had coined themselves: complete psychological malleability. To them, that wasn't tragedy. It was a success. They had erased James's mind, and now they could rebuild him however they wanted. And James? He was just the beginning, because after him, the doors stayed open. The Thornfield Institute began accepting more patients. Slowly, selectively, strategically. Each one came from wealthy families who could afford to make problems disappear, and each one was carefully chosen. The sisters had developed a disturbingly sophisticated intake system. They could spot the perfect victim. In minutes, they weren't looking for violent psychotics or unpredictable patients. They didn't want chaos. They wanted pain they could shape, anxiety, depression, trauma, people already cracked, just waiting for someone to apply pressure. The more suffering they found, the more perfect the subject became. And so the patients kept coming. And behind the mansion walls, the experiments continued. They came seeking healing. But what they found behind Thornfield's iron gates was a cathedral of madness, where hope was dissected, sanity was dissolved, and the soul was nothing more than a specimen under glass. Each patient arrived with trembling hands and guarded hope, walking willingly into a place they believed would offer them relief. But Thornfield was no sanctuary. It was a crucible, and the sisters were caretakers. They were architects of psychological collapse. One by one, the patients were funneled into carefully curated routines designed to disassemble them from within. At first, it all felt serene. The rooms were quiet, the staff polite, and the grounds immaculately kept. But beneath the polished veneer lurked an invisible machinery, the slow, invisible turning of gears, built to grind the psyche down to dust. James Wentworth was only the beginning. The Institute's basement had been transformed into a subterranean labyrinth of terror disguised as therapy. Room after room bore no resemblance to the medical wards of the day. One chamber was tiled entirely, with mirrors, not ordinary reflections, but fractured, curved surfaces that bent a patient's own image until they no longer recognized themselves. Another room pulsed with subsonic vibrations, sounds just below, The threshold of hearing, felt rather than heard, that made the very bones tremble. And then there were the moving walls, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A room would shrink by inches each day enough to sow unease without immediate notice, until the patient, in a state of sleep-deprived disorientation, would awaken and feel the suffocating dread of being entombed alive. Margaret's emotional amplification was not mere suggestion. It was a deliberate summoning of demons long buried, turning fear into an environment, grief into a routine, and trauma into a mirror that never stopped reflecting. She created entire daily schedules around dread, tailoring each minute to exploit a specific vulnerability. Ella Lenina, with her unassuming vials and powders, wove hallucinations into the air itself. Her botanical knowledge allowed her to brew concoctions that induced dread without any external cause. A patient might sit alone in a room and see the door melt, or hear whispers calling from beneath the floorboards. These were not dreams. They were realities, manufactured ones, and Beatrice made sure the body would remember what the mind might try to escape. Ice-cold floors, blinding lights at midnight, sound patterns that prevented REM sleep. Her domain was sensation, and she wielded it like a scalpel. Together, they were meticulous, clinical, almost loving in their cruelty. But to them, it wasn't cruelty. It was discovery. By the end of 1845, the sisters had created a network of ritualized psychological unmaking. Each patient was a different case study, each mind a fortress to be taken apart brick by brick until only the raw materials of personality remained. And from that rubble, the sisters believed something better could be built, a new consciousness, obedient, open, and unflinchingly pure. But what the sisters failed to consider, what no scientist should ever forget, is that some ruins are sacred, and some minds, once broken, don't return. They haunt, and Thornfield was about to learn what it means to be haunted. She couldn't remember her name. Her body trembled with every gust of wind. The townspeople thought she was mad. But Mary Hutchinson was not mad. She was a survivor of something far worse than madness. Psychological trauma. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were still trapped inside the walls of the Institute. Her speech was fragmented, filled with incomplete sentences and sudden silences, and she flinched at the sound of doors closing or footsteps echoing through the hallway. Dr. Foster tried to piece together her story, but it was like assembling a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The only words she consistently repeated were sisters, walls, and the humming. When shown a simple mirror, Mary screamed, clawed at her reflection, and had to be sedated. Word of Mary's condition spread rapidly through Falmouth. Concern turned to suspicion. Whispers began, circulating in church pews and tavern corners, about the Thornfield sisters and their increasingly secretive operation. But despite the unease, few dared to question them directly. The Thornfields were educated, wealthy, and cloaked in perceived righteousness of their religious mission. Inside the Institute, the sisters responded to Mary's escape not with fear, but with scientific curiosity. Beatrice took it as a failure of physical containment. Elena worried her dosages needed refinement, but it was Margaret who showed no concern, only calm reflection. The experiment has merely entered a new phase, she wrote in her private journal. With growing paranoia, they doubled their secrecy. Windows were boarded from the inside. Patients were gagged during transport. Journal entries now described a shift from healing trauma to inducing it. The goal was no longer rehabilitation. It was full psychological erasure, followed by behavioral reprogramming. But outside their crumbling sanctuary of horrors, a storm was brewing. The community's silence was breaking, and the name Mary Hutchinson would soon become the key that unlocked one of the darkest chapters in Cumberland's history. She ran barefoot through the night, her gown torn, her breath shallow, mumbling the same 4 words. Over and over again, "They're still watching me." The town of Falmouth was not prepared for the sight of Mary Hutchinson, her face pale as parchment, eyes sunken and unfocused, hands trembling from trauma no one yet understood. Dr. Edmund Foster had seen many broken souls in his years of rural medicine, but never one quite like her. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with fear, it was with haunting certainty. "There are no windows because we weren't meant to see the world," she whispered. What followed were fragments, blurred images of metal restraints, whispers from behind walls, meals, laced with strange powders. But it was a recollection of the sisters that chilled even the seasoned. "Physician, they never blinked," Mary said. "They didn't care if we screamed. They only cared if we stopped." The Thornfield Institute had promised sanctuary, especially for families ashamed of their relatives' mental afflictions. But Mary's words hinted at something far more sinister. And though the Institute denied her ever being in their care, the scars on her wrists, the unnatural calm in her gaze, and the gaps in her memory told another story. Dr. Foster knew he had to act. He visited the grounds of the Thornfield Institute under the pretense of professional consultation. What he saw disturbed him deeply. Brick walls stained with chemicals, rooms with bolted doors, and a pervasive silence broken only by the ticking of clocks and the faint shuffling of unseen patients. But when he tried to raise alarm, the resistance he faced was immediate and overwhelming. The Thornfield sisters were not just healers, they were untouchable. Their connections ran deep. Clergy, governors, shipping magnates, all of whom had placed loved ones in their care. No one wanted scandal. No one wanted truth. Mary's death, ruled a natural consequence of her madness, closed the door for many, but not for Dr. Foster. His notes, hidden for years after his own mysterious disappearance in 1848, would later be discovered in the ruins of his former practice. Pages filled with drawings, patient names, formulas, and a single line repeated throughout. They called it treatment. It was a ritual. The letter arrived without warning. No return address, no signature, only a single line scrawled in crimson ink. She was never insane. She was silenced. In the summer of 1846, in the shadow of New England's pristine hills, whispers began to escape the iron gates of a place few dared to question, the Thornfield Institute for the Mentally Unwell. But what lay behind those ivy-covered walls was not healing. It was something far older, darker, and deliberate. This is not just a tale of a forgotten asylum. It's a true descent into the psyche of those who wore the habit of virtue and practiced a doctrine of control. What Dr. Everett Foster uncovered would cost him his career and very nearly his mind. Martha's account was both specific and deeply disturbing. She described a facility where patients were kept in basement rooms that resembled prison cells more than medical treatment areas. She had been instructed to prepare meals according to very specific instructions, never altering the ingredients, always delivering them directly to a designated staff member, never speaking to the patients. She had seen syringes, vials, and trays filled with strange powders, many of which she could not identify. Late at night, she heard screams. Not the random cries of disturbed minds, but long, drawn-out wails that seemed purposeful, almost rehearsed. One night, unable to sleep, she had wandered toward the infirmary and saw something she would never forget. Sister Eleanor kneeling beside a patient, whispering in Latin, her hands stained red, not with blood, but with something black and thick, as if pulled from the very walls. Martha had fled the next morning. That single testimony cracked the door open. Dr. Foster began compiling a dossier, letters, testimonies, supply records, and coded correspondences. The picture that emerged was chilling. A network of women cloaked as healers orchestrating psychological experiments across the eastern seaboard under the guise of sanctity. And their patients? Forgotten souls, orphans, widows, unwanted wives, the poor. Society never missed what it never acknowledged, and deep in the bowels of Thornfield, something was being born, not medical progress, but a system of psychological control, manipulation, and destruction, a system run by the sisters. By the fall of 1846, a quiet storm was brewing behind the walls of the Thornfield Institute, a storm stitched together with forged letters, broken minds, and the cries of forgotten souls. James Wentworth's father, a man of stoic New England resolve, had tried for months to quiet the unease, gnawing at his chest. But it was the letters, the unnatural, oddly detached letters, that finally pushed him to act. At first, they had felt like James, thoughtful, warm, full of that quick wit his family cherished. But as the months passed, something in the ink began to rot. The vocabulary became stilted, mechanical. Sentences lacked the flair James had always had. And then, most chilling of all, the handwriting began to change. Subtly at first, as if penned by a trembling hand. Then, unmistakably, the elegant, slanted strokes of his son's pen were replaced by blocky, rigid lines. Cold, clinical, as if someone were imitating James, and not very well. When Dr. Foster held the two sets of letters side by side beneath the flickering oil lamp in his study, he knew something was terribly wrong. James wasn't healing. James wasn't writing. And perhaps James wasn't even alive. But Dr. Foster's next move was a gamble against the devil himself. He traveled alone to the outskirts of Ravens Hollow, to the gates of the Thornfield Institute, under the guise of an unscheduled medical audit. The sisters received him with polite smiles. Too polite. Constance offered tea laced with charm. Eleanor offered records laced with deceit. But Dr. Foster wasn't interested in what they gave freely. He was watching the shadows. He was listening for what they didn't say. And what he found buried in the locked ledger room would haunt him forever. A leather-bound journal, thick, weighty, and almost humming with darkness. It was not part of the official records. The entries were meticulous, clinical, and horrifying. Each patient was referred to by code, not name. Each treatment recorded not as care, but as stimulus. And each stimulus had a result: increased paranoia, reduced verbal ability, hallucinatory compliance. Page after page, experiment after experiment, all signed at the bottom in tight, elegant script. E.T. Dr. Foster's hands trembled as he closed the journal. There was no longer any doubt. The Thornfield sisters were not healers. They were something far worse. They were scientists of suffering. And the Institute was not a hospital. It was a lab, a hidden cathedral of madness, built on silence, sealed with false hope, and filled with souls that no one would come looking for. They came cloaked in piety and whispered salvation, but within the cold stone walls of Thornfield Institute, something ancient and inhuman had taken root, disguised in veils and vows. It was a letter that broke the illusion. When Dr. Foster held James Wentworth's final letter up to the dim light of his study, he didn't see a patient in recovery. He saw a signature warped by trembling fingers, vocabulary stripped bare of intelligence, and a soul eroded into silence. The early letters had been thoughtful and clear, written in James's unmistakable hand. The later ones, fragments of a man unraveling, or worse, impersonated entirely. This wasn't an isolated case. As Dr. Foster traced the pattern, handwriting samples from other patients, timelines, matching phrases, he unearthed a sickening reality. The Sisters of Thornfield had forged dozens of letters their counterfeit, communication sent like funeral hymns in ink to pacify families across New England. But what haunted him most wasn't the deceit. It was the purpose behind it. Through Martha the cook's testimony in the silent pages of confiscated journals, he discovered the chilling truth. The sisters weren't healers. They were researchers. They recorded every broken scream, every catatonic stare, every pharmacological failure with the dispassion of scientists meticulously cataloging the destruction of human minds as if they were studying the anatomy of insects. Patients were exposed to loud noises, blinding lights, starvation, sleep deprivation, and carefully measured chemical cocktails, experiments masked as therapy, all carried out behind heavy doors and beneath the sterile gaze of stained glass saints. And through it all, the sisters smiled. They believed their work held meaning, that unraveling sanity strand by strand might reveal something sacred about the human condition. But what they had truly built was a sanctum of horror hidden behind prayer and propriety, funded by the blind faith of noble families desperate for hope. 60 souls, perhaps more, all vanished behind those stone walls. Left to rot in padded cells, their screams unheard beyond the iron gates of the Institute. Dr. Foster had evidence. But the sisters had something stronger: power, secrecy, and allies in high places. And somewhere beneath the soil of Thornfield, the final truth was still waiting to be unearthed. And it wouldn't stay buried for long. What if I told you there was once a place so twisted, so secret, that it masqueraded as a sanctuary for the mentally ill, yet behind its locked doors, it was a chamber of horrors where science was just a mask for cruelty. Instead of achieving the psychological breakdown the sisters had hypothesized, Thomas Bellingham's mind collapsed entirely. The hallucinations never stopped. He screamed for 3 days straight, his voice shredding, raw with torment, until silence fell. But it wasn't peace. It was death. Beatrice watched it unfold. She had administered the final dose herself. And when she saw the lifeless stare in Thomas's eyes, something inside her broke. All the medical terminology, all the clinical language, they no longer disguised what they were doing. This wasn't research. This was murder dressed in a white coat. She fled the Institute that night. In Dr. Foster's candlelit office, her confession spilled out in tremors and whispers. She handed over journal entries, hundreds of pages, the sisters' notes, clinical observations, patient responses, dosages, side effects, failures. And in those pages, Dr. Foster found the true blueprint of madness, not from the patients, but from the minds of the women who ran Thornfield. Each patient had been methodically broken, some with isolation, some with hallucinogens, others through gaslighting and manipulation. The sisters documented it all, as if cataloging insects under a microscope. They even rated the purity of psychological collapse, a term they coined to describe how completely a personality could be dismantled, and yet they were respected, trusted. Families handed over their sons, daughters, wives, paid them, thanked them, and all the while behind iron gates and thick stone walls, the Thornfield Institute wasn't curing minds. It was annihilating them. Dr. Foster knew this was no ordinary case of malpractice. It was a conspiracy of silence and prestige. But now, with Beatrice's testimony and the documentation she risked her sanity to provide, he had what he needed, the final piece. The case was about to explode, but it would come at a terrible cost. Because some truths don't want to be uncovered, and those who buried them would do anything to keep them in the dark. The implications were staggering. What began as a local investigation into suspicious deaths at a remote asylum had now unfolded into a web of clandestine medical atrocities that stretched across continents. Dr. Foster sat in silence as Beatrice, her hands trembling and voice cracking, laid bare the full scale of the Thornfield operation. What chilled him most wasn't only the deaths, nor even the inhumanity. It was the calm, clinical way in which everything had been documented. Pages upon pages, she explained, were filled with notations, graphs, and observations, scientific records of human minds being methodically dismantled, pushed past the brink of sanity. The Thornfield sisters had cataloged everything: the stages of psychotic collapse, the thresholds for fear, induced paralysis, the point at which a person would stop recognizing their own identity. They treated suffering as data, an experiment where morality had been long discarded. And Thomas Bellingham had been the turning point, a brilliant young man whose parents had hoped the Institute could save him. Instead, he had become their most extreme subject, subjected to weeks of silent darkness, injected with compounds that blurred the line between nightmare and waking life. According to Beatrice, he began seeing things that weren't there, people whispering the walls, doors breathing, his own thoughts becoming voices that screamed at him. One morning, she opened the iron door to his chamber. What she saw ended her complicity. Thomas, curled on the cold stone floor, his body untouched, but his eyes wide and empty, his mouth stretched in a final silent scream, a death by terror itself. Beatrice never forgot that face. In that moment, she knew they had gone too far. The human soul, she told Dr. Foster, was not theirs to unmake, and yet her sisters had merely recorded his death, incinerated the body, and moved on to the next subject. But Beatrice couldn't. Not anymore. With trembling hands, she gave Dr. Foster a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with age and use. Inside, the names of patients, the dates of experiments, results, outcomes, deaths. It was a catalog of horror masquerading as science. And this ledger would become the key. As the snow fell over Portland in that bitter winter of 1847, Dr. Foster knew the time had come. The secrets of the Thornfield Institute could no longer remain buried. April 1847. The fog lay thick like a burial shroud over the New England hills, and as the carriage wheels ground against the gravel path, Dr. Nathaniel Foster knew this morning would either deliver salvation or bury every truth under a silence colder than the grave. The Thornfield Institute stood like a fortress of false benevolence, its red brick exterior hiding the darkness that had festered within for years. The sprawling grounds were eerily quiet, the trees bare from winter's grip, their limbs clawing at the gray sky, as though trying to warn him away. But Dr. Foster was done with silence. He had spent the last 6 months collecting the kind of evidence no court could ignore. Evidence of human experimentation, psychological torture, and covert murders masked as treatments. Inside the main hall, the 3 remaining Thornfield sisters, Margaret, Constance, and Lillian, stood, waiting, their faces molded into the masks of dignified professionalism. Beatrice was absent, and her absence screamed louder than any accusation. Dr. Foster, Margaret began with a smile too still to be genuine, we're honored by your visit. He didn't respond with pleasantries. Behind him stood Sheriff Hartwell, Dr. Whitman, and 2 trusted deputies. All had seen the preliminary evidence. All had sworn to act. Their tour began as expected. Gleaming hallways, sanitized treatment rooms, medical equipment, carefully laid out like surgical theater props. The sisters described their revolutionary methods with the same polished language that had once deceived countless families. But Foster saw through it all. He knew which rooms had once held patients now listed as released to family care. He knew which stains on the floorboards weren't iodine, and which walls muffled more than just crying. When he asked for patient records, the sisters produced them quickly, too quickly. Where's Mary Whitaker? He asked, voice calm but loaded. Margaret blinked. She passed in January. Pneumonia. He flipped the chart open. The date of death conflicted with Beatrice's journal. Mary had been alive and sedated weeks after. And Ernest Bloom? Foster continued. Another lie. Another missing patient. Another name to be written. In red. Then came the turning point. I'd like to meet the patients. Myself, he said, placing the chart gently on the desk, locking eyes with Constant. A pause. The air shifted. The calm in the room cracked. Lillian flinched just slightly. Margaret's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Foster knew then. They were preparing for a final cover-up, and he was already inside their lair. The confrontation had begun. Constance hesitated. For the first time that day, her composure cracked. A slight tremble in her breath, a darting glance toward Margaret, and then silence. The word basement hung in the air like a blade, suspended between accusation and revelation. Margaret stepped forward, her voice firm but fraying. I'm afraid that part of the Institute is off limits. The foundation is unstable. A hazard. Sheriff Hartwell narrowed his eyes. We've seen enough to suspect this entire place is a hazard. Dr. Foster moved closer, his voice low and unrelenting. You kept your most severe cases down there, didn't you? The ones who couldn't be made docile with. Your treatments. Where are they now? Where's Beatrice? The room fell silent. Even Lillian, always the quietest of the trio, turned her eyes downward. And then, without a word, Constance turned and walked toward the eastern wing. No resistance now, only the sound of footsteps echoing through sterile hallways, growing heavier as they descended. The stairs to the basement were narrow and steep. The air changed with each step, thicker, damp, and laced with the scent of mildew and something far more sinister. The door at the bottom was made of iron and bolted from the outside. Constance produced a key from around her neck, and with a groan of rusted hinges, the truth finally opened its mouth. The corridor was dim, lit only by flickering lanterns spaced too far apart. The walls, once white, were stained with damp and rot, and then the sounds, faint, pitiful moans, like the dying hum of minds too far, gone to scream. There were 6 cells. In each, a former patient sat or lay slumped against cold stone. Some had restraints around their wrists. Others scratched patterns into walls, repeating the same word or sound over and over like a ritual, detached from time, identity, or reality. But it was the final cell that changed everything. There, crumpled on the floor, was Sister Beatrice. Her face was pale and hollow, the light of zealotry extinguished from her eyes. Her hands trembled violently, and she mumbled incoherently. Dr. Foster rushed to her, kneeling beside her broken frame. "She's been experimented on," he muttered. "They turned on their own." Constance didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence screamed louder than any confession. What had started as a pursuit of understanding consciousness had become a crusade, a cruel dissection of the soul itself. The sisters crossed every line, buried every trace beneath science and scripture until there was nothing left but husks, data, control, and now, standing in the belly of that godless institution, Foster understood this place was never meant to heal. It was built to erase. The basement wasn't on any blueprint. No one spoke of it, not the staff, not the patients, and certainly not the sisters. But every night, muffled cries crept through the floorboards like prayers, turned inside out. When Dr. Foster descended those stairs, she wasn't walking into a hospital. She was stepping into a sanctum of madness built on broken minds and bottled souls. The sisters' journals were the final proof. Written in cold, meticulous detail, they outlined years of human experimentation that had taken place under the guise of spiritual healing. Page after page, they recorded how patients were selected, how their minds were broken down in stages, and how compliance was mistaken for a cure. But it wasn't just the content of the journals. It was their tone. The sisters wrote not with remorse or hesitation, but with a strange reverence, as if they believed they were messengers of divine truth, unlocking the mysteries of the human spirit through suffering. Each entry was more disturbing than the last. Subject 24A. Emotional response nullified after 47 days of sensory deprivation. Subject now exhibits ideal passivity. Tissue sample extracted for histological preservation. The inspection team stood in stunned silence. Even Sheriff Hartwell, who had seen his share of horrors, was pale as he read. When word reached the town, panic spread. Families demanded the return of their loved ones, only to be met with the unbearable truth. Many would never be the same. Some, it turned out, had never left the building at all. And beneath that institution, beneath its whitewashed halls and crosses on the walls, was a legacy, carved in suffering, deception, and a twisted belief that the soul could be purified through pain. The Sisters of St. Dymphna were arrested, but to this day, no one knows how many were lost in their so-called treatments. Some say the cries still echo beneath the stone floors of the basement, where sanity was stripped away, one layer at a time, in a cold, candlelit chamber beneath Thornfield Institute. For sisters stood before a row of glass coffins, each holding a body that would never speak again. But these weren't just corpses, they were called specimens. And behind every one was a secret the world was never supposed to know. The courtroom was silent as the jury read the verdict, guilty on all counts. But the silence didn't end there. It spread across the country like a cold, choking fog. Institutions that once boasted of modern treatments now scrambled to distance themselves from the Thornfield name. Medical journals quietly retracted articles that had once celebrated the sisters' innovations, and physicians who had proudly corresponded with Constance Thornfield burned letters, erased connections, and suddenly couldn't recall the nature of their communications. But what justice could truly be served? Over 70 lives lost in the name of science. Parents, siblings, children buried without ceremony, without graves. For many of the victims' families, justice felt like a poor substitute for truth. And the truth was far darker than anyone wanted to admit. At sentencing, Constance stood once more, calm, confident, not a flicker of doubt in her voice. "History," she said, "will remember us not as criminals, but as pioneers. You punish us today, but tomorrow's scientists will build on our work. They will thank us." She died by execution a year later, unrepentant. Margaret was declared insane and committed to a high-security asylum. Eleanor died of poisoning in her cell, a mixture of her own making. Only Beatrice lived to see the end of the trial and served 20 years before vanishing into obscurity. Her name changed her past. Buried like the patients she once watched suffer. The Thornfield Institute was demolished. All that remains is a rusted plaque where the gates once stood, and a whisper that still travels through the fog that clings to the forest nearby. They cured no one. They saved no one. But they watched and waited and experimented until the mind broke. Some say their journals are still out there, hidden in the ashes of what once was. Some say their theories have found new life in other hands, behind closed doors of institutions that now were more respectable names. But one thing is certain. The true terror wasn't in what they did. It was in the quiet approval they received, the letters that cheered them on, and the doctors who still believe that knowledge is worth any cost. The fire consumed everything, except the screams. For 3 days the Thornfield Institute burned, and no one dared go near it. By the time the trial concluded, America was no longer the same. The nation, once fascinated by the whispers of medical miracles coming from a forested corner of Maine, now watched in horror as the curtain was pulled back and monsters stood in the white gowns of doctors. The courtroom was packed daily, journalists elbowing for space, families of the victims holding portraits, and protesters lining the courthouse steps. For 6 months, the Thornfield sisters were tried not only in the court of law, but in the court of public morality. Medical journals that once praised their innovation now condemned their cruelty. And the public? They were no longer curious. They were furious. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco published the lurid details. Patients experimented on, without consent, injections that paralyzed instead of healed, and treatments designed not to cure, but to observe the breakdown of a human mind. The resulting outcry forced Congress to draft new legislation governing medical ethics, patient consent, and the regulation of private asylums. 3 sisters, Constance, Margaret, and Eleanor, were sentenced to death. Beatrice, the youngest, was spared for her cooperation and sentenced to life imprisonment. But fate had other plans. Legal delays kept the executions from ever happening. Constance died in her cell in 1851, her hands ink-stained and clutched around a journal titled The Structure of a Human Soul. Margaret passed 2 years later, still experimenting, this time on the minds of her fellow inmates. Eleanor? She was found dead in 1855, surrounded by crude chemical apparatus fashioned from prison scraps, her skin singed, her lips blackened. Beatrice Thornfield served 30 long years before quietly vanishing from public memory. After her release in 1877, she lived a life of quiet service, working with institutions for the mentally ill, though she never once spoke of her time at Thornfield. Some say she kept a single photograph tucked away in her wallet for a young girl standing proudly before the institute gates. But the most chilling chapter? It didn't end in the courtroom. It ended in flames. In 1848, the Thornfield Institute was engulfed in a fire so intense it took 3 days to die. Locals claimed they saw figures moving in the windows even as the building collapsed. Some reported whispers, voices, crying out long after the flames had consumed the walls. No cause was ever found. No records survived. The fire wiped out everything, or so it seemed. Decades passed, but the land refused to forget. Rebuilding attempts failed. Workers heard footsteps when they were alone. Tools disappeared, and shadows lingered where no one stood. Eventually, the land was abandoned, fenced off, and forgotten until 1895. That year, the state of Maine declared the property sacred. A park was established. At its center stands a gray stone monument, weathered and plain. On our 73 names, patients, experiments, forgotten souls. But locals still say, if you stand near the stone after dark, the air grows heavy. And if you listen carefully, you might just hear one of them whisper your name. They called it a hospital, but in the cold silence beneath its chapel walls, it was something far more ancient, far more sinister. At Thornfield, no one screamed, not because there was no pain, but because the pain was so carefully administered, so clinically measured, that it broke the will before it touched the voice. Patients arrived in silence and left in pieces, not just of mind, but of soul. Dr. Elaine Foster had heard rumors, odd referrals, untraceable deaths, medical records that abruptly ended mid-sentence. But it wasn't until she received a package in the mail, a package with no return, address filled with blood-smeared journal pages and a hand-drawn map, that she began to understand the true horror of what lay beneath Thornfield's sterile facade. The tip came from a former patient named Beatrice, or what was left of her. She claimed the sisters weren't just caregivers. They were scientists of suffering, and beneath the floorboards, in the dark arteries of the Institute, they had built something unholy, a laboratory of madness. When Sheriff Hartwell and Dr. Foster demanded entry to the basement, the sisters resisted, claimed privacy, confidentiality, sanctity. But sanctity is not a word that survives where blood has soaked the foundations. And when the lock gave way and the door creaked open, what they found wasn't a treatment facility. It was a shrine to cruelty disguised as care. There were rooms where mirrors created endless, shifting versions of self until a person no longer recognized their own reflection. Rooms where walls closed in, inch by inch, until the air became a weapon. One chamber was soundproofed and equipped with devices that generated frequencies that shattered the nerves, the mind, the will. And then they found preserved brains. Hundreds of glass containers, each labeled, each cataloged, each representing a human being, reduced to a specimen in an unholy archive of suffering. The sisters had pioneered techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until decades later. Psychological fragmentation, emotional inversion, personality erasure, torture, disguised as progress. They called it research. And in their meticulous journals, they even noted the moments when a person broke, like watching a clock strike midnight. It was the purest form of scientific sadism. Their patients were not patients. They were ingredients in an experiment that no ethical code could contain. And still, despite the horror, the documentation was immaculate. When the trials concluded and the sisters were locked away, society breathed a sigh of relief. But in the margins of their writings, researchers later found mentions of other places, other facilities, places never found, colleagues never named. And those dark corners of history, those basements with no blueprints, may still be out there, waiting, Some say the Thornfield Institute was just one node in a network of pain. Others believe the sisters died with their secrets. But walk through the memorial park that now stands where the facility once loomed, and you'll feel it. A silence that presses on your bones. A chill that doesn't come from a wind, as if the ground remembers. Some truths are buried not in earth, but in silence. And sometimes that silence echoes. So I ask you, what price are we willing to pay for progress? And who watches when science forgets to be human? Leave your thoughts in the comments. But remember, these stories aren't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to confront the shadows in the mirror.